Welcome everyone to the ISM Rochester April membership meeting. I want to just give one program note that our next webinar will be on May 6th, and it will be at noon Eastern Time on the topic of managing personnel and business remotely. So register today. Our speaker today, Tom Cook, will also be the speaker for May 6th. Also, please be sure to ask any questions today using the chat or the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen, as we would like this to be an interactive program. And I believe Tom is going to pose some questions to you as well. Our speaker today will be Tom Cook, who is the CEO, Managing Director of Blue Tiger International. It is a premier international business consulting company on supply chain management, trade compliance, purchasing, global trade, and logistics. Tom was the former CEO of American River International in New York, which I'm sure some of you may remember him at that time, and Apex Global Logistics Supply Chain Operations in Los Angeles. He has over 30 years experience in assisting companies all over the world managing their import and export operations. He is also a member of the New York District Export Council, sits on the board of numerous corporations, and is considered a leader in the business of verticals that he works in. Tom is also the director of the National Institute of World Trade, a 30-year-old educational and training organization based on Long Island. I would like to now turn the program over to our speaker today, Tom Cook.
Thank you, Kathy, and appreciate, Kathy, all the work that you do to put these webinars together. I know that all the organizations that you represent appreciate that, and certainly us as speakers do as well. So a big thank you out to you. So you have a basic idea of the background, and what my company does and what I do is supply chain consulting. And a lot of the work that we do circles around risk and spend and best ways to possibly do that. And the idea of mitigating tariffs and duties, or what we refer to as the landed costs, is a focus of this conversation, but has been a focus of the work that we do, particularly since President Trump took office, because he put forth certain duties and tariffs on steel and aluminum and goods coming out of China that really impacted the costing model for lots of companies, not only here in the United States, but all over the world. And that kind of put the whole concept of risk and spend on steroids. And that continues as we go into the Biden administration and as we go into 2021, and we anticipate it to continue all the way into 2022. So what I try to bring to the table here relative to this webinar and the work that we do as a consultant is really just bring our experience and what things have worked over the years, what things haven't worked, our insight into corporations. About 2 years ago, we did a study, and we actually have impacted well over 1,000 corporations, from some of the largest ones in the United States to small mom and pop operators and everything in between. So we have a pretty good experience model, and we're very connected into global supply chain. So we have a lot of resources to draw upon, which comes into this discussion as well. So I mentioned just a moment ago about the 232 and the 301 tariffs. These things have significantly impacted the cost of bringing goods into the United States that are sourced around the world, and things that impact the cost of manufacturing, where we have raw materials, components, and parts that we bring in from overseas. The 232 tariffs relate to steel and aluminum from 13 different countries, and the 301 tariffs are focused on China. It expands to about 40 to 45% of all the products that we import from China. And there are lists 1, 2, 3, and 4. And basically, it's a 25% additional impact on the cost of bringing those goods into the United States. So we have what we show here as a landed cost calculator. And this is a model that we try to get all people involved in supply chain to use when they're trying to figure out where they're going to source products from. And even domestically, we use a landed cost model as well. It just doesn't have as many of the line items as one does internationally. But we have this whole group of all these items that we're looking at, from the cost of the material to the transportation, okay, to customs costs that are involved, deconsolidation, consolidation, and various fees that are involved, including transportation and storage at a final destination. But you see I've highlighted in red there, duties, taxes, VAT, and GST are significant expenses that are added into this. And when President Trump came along, this grew by 25% on a significant amount of commodities that we have. But the whole concept of trying to reduce duty and taxes is not relevant to just when President Trump. We've been doing this for over 30 years. The idea is if we can do anything to reduce our landed costs, we want to look that up and do it. So appreciate that risk and costs impacts our margin in our business models. It impacts our competitiveness. It potentially increases the risk involved in loss of market or clients, and the loss of a business model, which is designed to recover a certain amount of profitability on the transactions in our buying and selling as any corporate business model that we have in place. So some of the things that we're going to be talking about are related to this whole page here, but you'll see highlighted is really what I want to first really get into is things that are available, such as free trade agreements, bonded warehouses, foreign trade zones, and some of the other things such as demand planning, and what we also call tariff engineering, because this is really a focus that we spend time on with companies and how best to reduce the landed costs. So when we look at Trump, who really initiated this whole concept on steroids back in 2017, we're now under a new administration, and that new administration has announced to us, to the United States and to the world, that it's their intent to maintain the tariffs that Trump has put in place at least through to the middle to the end of 2022. So a lot of people were hoping that when Biden came in, he was going to issue executive orders very similar to Donald Trump, but in fact, he didn't cancel any of those things out. And the Secretary of Commerce has put forth that those tariffs that are in place will stay in place and won't be looked at until the end of next year. When we look at the whole concept of landed cost and we look at our responsibilities, particularly those of us that are in the supply chain, is we have to remember that this has to be a collaborative process with the various other silos in our organization. One being purchasing, supply chain, transportation and logistics, engineering. I'm going to talk to you about tariff engineering, which requires your engineering personnel, your technical people to get involved in that conversation, research and development, customer service, sales and business development management, finance, legal, as well as your vendors, suppliers, and customers, and more importantly, senior management. And senior management needs to be involved mainly because of the fact that there's going to be a need for change within an organization, both culturally and tactically, as well as the additional factors of costs that are involved in implementing some of the strategies that we're going to outline today. So the focus from that list that we had before is free trade agreements, drawback, bonded warehousing, foreign trade zones, alternative sourcing, tariff engineering, demand planning. And you're welcome at any point in time to ask questions and post them, and certainly at the end. And any subject matter related to international business or international supply chain, you're welcome to bring up as a conversation point. So free trade agreements is where I'd like to start the conversation. And the free trade agreement is what we have with NAFTA, which is now called USMCA, CAFTA, the Central American Free Trade Agreement, the Korean Free Trade Agreement, the Israeli Free Trade Agreement, the Australia-New Zealand Free Trade Agreement, plus a dozen more. There are 21 in place. And the whole concept of those in place is what they're trying to do is to invigorate the trade that exists between the United States and those countries by both countries eliminating duties and tariffs and taxes and making goods that pass through each other's borders be able to be done in a much more easier fashion. Okay, some of those countries I have outlined here: Australia, Bahrain, Chile, Colombia, all the Caribbean countries, and also focused on Dominican Republic, Israel, Jordan, Korea, Morocco, NAFTA, which is Canada, the United States, and Mexico, now referred to as USMCA. Oman, Panama, Peru, and Singapore are a bunch of the countries that are in that program. So the reason that we think about this is that if it's possible that we can source our finished products, raw materials, components, and parts in these countries, one of the big benefits that happens is the ease of it moving from one country to the other, and also the elimination of and/or the reduction of the duties and taxes that would normally be paid. So the United States enters into a trade agreement. This agreement has trade guidelines, timing, products, exclusions, parameters of the agreement. But the concept is that when the goods enter either of the countries, the clearance process controls have a preference program, and the goods enter either totally duty-free or at a reduced rate of duty. So we have to question, where do we source from? Now, a lot of people automatically go to China, and there's no question about the fact that China, from an industrial standpoint, is very strong, okay? Can be considered, if not the leader in the world, it's either in the number 1 or 2 position, along with the United States. But it's an easy place to find industrial type of sourcing. So a lot of people turn there very quickly. But in fact, if we take the time and look at other countries, we find that they offer significant options as well. I'm going to talk in a few moments about the industrialization of Mexico as an example. And then we have to question the question, can we leverage ourselves by looking at that free trade agreement? And when we create that landed cost model, does it evidence to us that in fact it makes sense to look at a free trade agreement country? So if we take an example of looking at a transaction of going to a free trade agreement country like Mexico, as compared to China, which would be a typical comparison that we get involved with very often, we make the assumption that the acquisition cost, meaning that what we buy it for in China and what we buy it for in Mexico, would be on par or similar. The quality control comes up to the same level. However, we find that the lead time in Mexico is 3 weeks as compared to 9 weeks on this particular product or commodity. So there's a benefit right there. We look at a 40-foot trailer that's coming up from Mexico versus a 40-foot container coming in from China. And now these costs have been inflated because of the fact that transportation costs, both out of Mexico and China, have gone up dramatically, almost twice this amount. But the savings parameter still exists, that we're looking at the difference between $700 versus $2,000 or $1,300 difference every time one particular container or truck moves. Duties and taxes, there aren't any out of Mexico. Out of China, this particular product that we're using as the example is at 4%. And as history has proven, that it is less costly and less much involved from a management perspective of managing the vendor in Mexico than it is in China. So there's savings and benefit in that regard as well. So one of the things that we always like to do is to create the return on the investment model, the business model that supports our decision, particularly when we're involved in purchasing or sourcing or supply chain, and we're going to make a decision to, let's say, use that free trade agreement and move manufacturing, maybe not all of it, but a portion of it, to, in this case, to Mexico. How do we justify making that decision? Obviously, there's the qualitative part of it, which is just getting our head around those benefits that I just outlined. But really, the important aspect is the quantitative process, using science and mathematics to justify that decision. So in this case, I create an Excel spreadsheet. I have 2 columns, China and Mexico. I look at the acquisition cost, the export charges, the freight charges, duties, taxes, customs clearance, the total transactional cost for each one of them. And what I determine when I look down to the bottom right-hand corner is that transactionally, by sourcing in Mexico, a free trade agreement country, I'm saving as much as $19,000 per transaction. If I have 2 imports weekly, okay, that's savings of over $2 million a year. Now, obviously, this is a very simplified approach, but it gives you the idea of what the benefits would be when we go down this particular path. In Mexico, unique to all other countries that we have free trade agreements with, there's another program which aligns itself with the USMCA program called the Maquiladora program. And what this does, it's specifically designed for the United States, that if a Mexican company imports raw materials, components, or parts, and does the manufacturing in Mexico in a approved, certified maquiladora factory, okay, then when those goods come into Mexico, they'll come in duty free because ultimately those goods are going to be destined for the United States. So the maquiladora program is designed for factories, industrial locations in Mexico that import materials for the manufacturing or assembly process for goods that are going to come into the United States. So it creates another whole advantage because Mexico company is not paying duties or taxes on those goods that are coming into the maquiladora program. So maquiladora is managed locally, but can be operated by foreign interests. Business obtains a status. You look at the Fortune 1000 companies in the United States, more than half of them have an interest, either directly or indirectly, in the maquiladora program. The general location of these is along the border going from California through to Texas, okay? And it's generally about a 50-mile swath of land, but there are exceptions outside of that that are located further south in Mexico. So the concept here is that Mexico not only presents the benefits of a free trade agreement, but the maquiladora program adds another whole level of financial benefit to the transaction. So we just recently did some work for a Charlotte-based plumbing supply distributor where they were manufacturing completely 100% of their needs in China and have been for over almost 15 years now. So what we did was we took a third of their manufacturing production and moved it into that Mexico maquiladora program. It was valued about $10 million worth of activity. The idea was that we experimented with this about a year and a half ago, and if in fact it worked, then we were going to increase it to about 60 or 70% of the production that came out of China. In this particular case, they still source the materials from China in terms of the parts and the components, but in that it's assembled in Mexico in the maquiladora program, it comes in duty-free into Mexico, and when those finished products now come into the United States, they come in duty-free. So at the end of the day, on $10 million worth of activity, this company is saving somewhere in the neighborhood of $2.5 to $3 million on that spend by going into that program. So another program which is very beneficial is Drawback. Drawback is a program that Customs here in the United States offers to US companies. Those companies that import things into the United States, pay duties and taxes, and now those products get exported from the United States. And you can now claim up to 99% of the duties and taxes that you paid. And the key issue here is that you don't necessarily have to be the importer and you don't necessarily have to be the exporter. You just have to evidence the customs that in your purchase price from let's say you buy it from a distributor, that distributor imported it. So within your purchase price, those duties and taxes are included. You just have to evidence that. And when it goes out, the same thing. If you sell it to a company who then exports it, you just have to have the ability to evidence that it was exported. And you can get back up to 99% of your duties and taxes. We just did a project for a company that was based in New York City, and that company had about $30 million worth of export activity, but it had about $10 million worth of imports into that. That $10 million represented about $1 million worth of duties and taxes. We put together a drawback program, and they're getting back a little over $900,000 of that $1 million as a refund in the drawback program that we put together for them. Drawback process is an evidentiary process of accountability down to the SKU, product code, or lot number level. So you have to be able to identify to customs the products that come in at that very detailed level, and as they go out from that detailed level. Now, for those of you that might have bulk commodities, let's say if it was chemical or food products, there's an actual allowance for algorithms that move the bulk commodities through that process. Okay, so really, at the end of the day, we just have to be able to create this process evidentiary that tracks the product from origin all the way through to sale and destination. So again, we look to creating a process to include math and science in our decision-making process so that it becomes a quantitative analysis. So we create this spreadsheet in comparing the drawback process. So in this case here, company imports $5.5 million annually. It pays an average of 4.5% duty rate. And I appreciate if some of these goods were on the 301 or 232 tariff list, you would have potentially an impact of another 25% that's added to it, so it could be pretty dramatic. So in this particular case, the duty cost annually is $247,000. The company exports 40% of what it imports, okay? So that's worth about $99,000, and the benefit is 99% of $99,000, which is $98,000 benefit to the company. And there's an administration fee that averages around 10% of the monies that's collected. So about of $98,000, a company would have costs of about $9,000 to get that benefit. It varies company to company, but that's the average. So again, here's the business model that justifies this decision. So we have additional considerations in drawback relative if the product has been already excluded, such as if you bought something from Mexico or Canada, there wouldn't be duty on it, so there would be no need for drawback. And we have an ability that if we want to set up a drawback program, one time we can go back anywhere from 3 to 5 years on our prior activity. This presents a huge check to some companies that have had the situation for a long period of time. They can go back, but it's a one-shot deal that's allowed. And you have to be hooked up to ACE, the Automated Commercial Environment, which is a very easy thing to do, meaning that you have an electronic relationship with customs to be able to submit the claims into their facility. So another program that provides a lot of benefit is what we refer to as bonded warehouses. So a bonded warehouse is a physical warehouse or location that's geographically located within the United States, but actually anything that's in the bonded warehouse has yet to enter the US economy. So the bonded warehouse allows goods to move through the border without paying duties or taxes into that warehouse. And while it's stored in that warehouse, there's no responsibility to pay duties and taxes. So the big benefit of the bonded warehouse and why we do that is that we defer our duty responsibility until we pull it out of that warehouse, which usually will be point of sale. So depending upon our inventory turn and how long we keep something, this could be a huge benefit from a cash flow standpoint. The other thing is that if the goods get exported from that bonded warehouse, there would be no obligation to pay duties or taxes because, in fact, the goods have never entered the United States. Physically, they have, but not economically. And that's what customs looks at in terms of determining duties and taxes. So again, it's a physical warehousing location sitting outside the US economy. It's sanctioned by the CBP, but independently operated. So you can make your own facility a bonded location, or you could use a third-party facility. Lots of freight forwarders, custom house brokers, 3PLs, and various types of service providers all will provide you access to their bonded facilities if they have it. It can be owned or third party. The goods entering the bonded facility can be quality controlled. They can be inspected. They can be weighed. They can be checked. They can be repacked, remarked, and relabeled, but cannot be materially changed. What that means is if it comes in as a widget, it has to go out as a widget. So a bonded warehouse provides all these benefits, but we're not allowed to materially change the product that's in that location. And goods may be stored up to 5 years in that location. is actually a 2-year window, and then you can get extensions on that by going to customs and requesting it. And there are various accounting, security, and personnel standards that have to be met in these locations. As an example, security, you can't have unferreted access to the facility. There's got to be some level of security that prevents somebody from just walking off the street and entering into the area that's bonded. In personnel, the guideline is that there are no persons allowed who might have a felony conviction on their record, as an example. So again, we take the circumstance to look at the quantitative process in our decision-making to build a financial model to justify our decision to go down this path. So in this case, the example that I have focused here is a company that has imported $5.5 million, paying 4.5%. The duty on that is $247,000. The company exports 40% of what it imports, which in this case is $99,000. The company imports the goods into the bonded warehouse, and at that time, there's no obligation to pay duty or taxes because those goods are not yet entering the U.S. economy. That duty payment is deferred until the goods are withdrawn from that bonded warehouse and the goods are imported to the United States, which could be the next day, or it could be 6 months later, or a year and a half later, depending upon your inventory turn and how your sales model works. So in this particular case, 6 months after the entry into the bonded facility, $50,000 of the goods are sold to a company in Columbus, Ohio. It's only at that point in time, that point of sale, that the goods are now being declared to customs for import, and that $2,200 obligation is only due at that point in time. 7 months after entry into the bonded facility, $100,000 worth of the goods are exported to Toronto, Canada. The goods have never entered the United States economy, therefore no duties are paid, so there would be a zero obligation. So there's a huge cash flow advantage here, as duties are not paid until point of value when they're sold. Okay, and if the goods are exported, then there's no obligation to pay at all. We work with a lot of companies here in the United States and also foreign companies that operate bonded facilities here in the United States, where they do, an example, North American distribution, where the goods might come in from Europe, they might come in from Asia, they might come in from Latin America, and then from that location, they're distributed to other places, to Canada, Mexico, the Caribbean, as an example, okay? And we do a North American distribution in Caribbean from the United States. Miami happens to be a big area where this is done, but basically all the port areas along the East Coast, the Gulf, and the West Coast all are set up with lots of these bonded facilities that you can access. So again, your option here is you can do this in your own facility. It could be a portion of your facility or the whole facility, or you could outsource it to a third party. So the real exciting thing, and we probably have at any point in time as many as 30 to 35 projects going relative to this subject, which is the use of foreign trade zones. And foreign trade zones, some people say, are bonded warehouses that are on steroids, is sometimes how it's referred to. So unlike bonded warehouses, a foreign trade zone, when it's set up, works exactly the same way, which is that when the goods go into a foreign trade zone, they have yet to enter the US economy. So it gets the deferral of that tax and duty very similar and works exactly the same way as the bonded warehouse. But the big advantage of the foreign trade zone is that a company is allowed to materially change the product. The example that I use that most people can get their head around very easily is many years ago, we were involved with BMW in their setting up a foreign trade zone down in Greer, South Carolina, around the year 2000. And the purpose was to import parts and components and finish the assembly process here in the United States. So you bring in an engine, you bring in tires, you bring in seats, you bring in leather, you bring in electrical components, plastic tubing, rubber, all the different things that you make. Some things might be sourced domestically here in the United States, but most things are sourced overseas. You bring that in and you assemble a car, you now have a tariff shift which has occurred. And that tariff shift allows you to declare the lower value of either the finished product or the components and raw materials. And as a general rule in customs is that if you have a finished product, it is more likely to have a lower duty rate than the component or raw material or part that's used in the manufacturing process. So when I use BMW as an example, it's good because if you looked at all the foreign car manufacturers, almost every one of them operate now foreign trade zones where they do assembly and manufacturing of their cars here in the United States. They don't do that to use American labor. They do that because they get great economic advantage in doing so. We're going to look at a model in a moment to see how huge an advantage that a foreign trade zone is. So a foreign trade zone provides tremendous advantage. The example I mentioned here is electronic components are imported to a foreign trade zone to assemble into a surge protector. Duty is not paid until such time the goods are withdrawn from the foreign trade zone and entered into the United States. And if the goods are exported, the duty is never paid. The rate of duty paid may be based on the foreign material placed in the zone, or may be based on the finished article, whichever is to the zone user's advantage. And that's a key factor. And I just want to digress for a moment because I'm broadcasting from Long Island, New York, and we're in the middle of a very severe thunderstorm. So you may hear some rumble and thunder in the background, which I'm hearing. I'm not sure if it's coming through to you, but it's coming through quite heavily now. So you hear it, it's nature calling out. So the foreign trade zone has an opportunity for reduced clearances charges because we don't have to do the entries transactionally as goods come in. We're allowed, when the goods go out, to do one weekly manifest clearance, which reduces not only our customs clearance charges, because it's not done transactionally, it's done by a manifest for all the activity once a week. But we also have the benefit of what they refer to as reduced merchandise processing fees, which max out against one transaction versus multiple transactions during the week. About 3 years ago, we were approached by a company in Houston, and it's a computer manufacturer. They do all their manufacturing in China, and they have a huge 1 million square foot facility down in Houston, and they receive between 30 and 40-foot container loads a week coming out of 3 Asian countries into their facility. In that facility, the only thing that they do after they discharge the container is they do a quality control check and a remarking and relabeling of the packaging. There's nothing else done to the product. So it comes in as an electronic component, it goes out exactly the same thing as whatever that electronic component is. But the big advantage to that company in using the foreign trade zone, in this case, is not manufacturing or assembly, because that's not done there. It's the fact that they were being charged $125 for a clearance 30 to 40 times a week. And that now is being done one time a week. So they've reduced their charges by $7,000 or $8,000 a week just by that factor. And then the merchandise processing fee, which caps out at $528 per transaction, that is being reduced by a multiple of 30 to 40 times. They're saving almost $1 million of reduced merchandise processing fees by doing that weekly manifest clearance. And that's their reason for doing the foreign trade zone. So it presents a lot of advantage, not only relative to the manufacturing and assembly, but also in how we handle the import process of the goods that originate from overseas and come through the facility in the United States. So here we take a look at the example of the foreign trade zone, again looking at a quantitative model that gives us a scientific and mathematical equation that justifies the return on the investment in this transaction. So in 2015, a company imports $80 million of finished product from China. The duty rate on the finished goods is 5.8%. The annual duty cost in this case is 4.6 million. Now, appreciate the fact that this duty rate could be an additional 25% depending upon whether it fits into that 301 category. So that would just make the benefit even much greater. In 2016, the company sets up an assembly facility in Mount Olive, New Jersey. The company now imports components, parts, raw materials, various countries, duty rates, raw materials, and components rate from free to 3%. The goods move into the foreign trade zone and do not enter the United States economy, therefore no duties are paid. So there we have that cash flow advantage as we saw in the bonded location. The goods now enter the United States at a point of sale. The duties are only applied to $40 million of the value of the parts, components, and raw materials. The annual duty cost is 2.3 million. But in the United States, as compared to manufacturing or assembly overseas, we do have an increase in labor costs. Okay. In this case, it adds additional $400,000. So we have to factor that into the model. So our total costing is now 2.7 million. However, the benefit, as we outlined before, is 1.9 million. Okay. If this company imports $1 billion worth of activity, okay, the benefits to this company is in excess of $24 million. Other benefits are deferral of the duties, state and tax incentives, the quality control is done here in the United States rather than overseas, the cost of doing business, the consistency of resources, obviously the benefits of our infrastructure, both in power and travel and transportation, and the ability to also include USA sourcing in the model as well, which may make sense in any particular business model. So again, it's an oversimplified model, but it does create the circumstances for us to really want to look at some of these solutions because of the significant opportunity for benefit. Next thing is the concept of alternative sourcing management. And in our organization, foreign trade zones and alternative sourcing management go back each month about one or two. Again, we probably have somewhere between 30 and 35 projects going on. The concept here is that generally what I have found, particularly in supply chain and people involved in purchasing and sourcing, is that once we find a company overseas and they're doing a good job, the quality control is fine, the pricing seems to be competitive, we tend to get somewhat complacent about that relationship and we get very comfortable about it. And the big question is, are we even looking for, are we searching for what might be potential options? Now, when Trump came into office and all of a sudden there was these increased costs, it certainly made many purchasing executives and people in supply chain uncomfortable because they were now forced to, because of those increased costs, to find alternative sources. And the reality is that there are a lot of alternative sources to China. Not in every commodity, not in every business vertical and model, but in most there is. We have found in places such as India, Sri Lanka, Vietnam, Malaysia, Philippines, Indonesia, Taiwan, South Korea, Mexico, okay, Israel, and right back here in the United States as an alternative source than China, as an example, that we found to be extremely successful as well. So we want to consider options not only because of increased costs, but the concept of sourcing diversity and having multiple options in our supply chain. In the whole concept of PPE, the personal protection equipment, when the pandemic first broke out in January, February, and March, and really became a big factor for the world in April and May, everybody was trying to buy face masks and gloves and face shields and cloths and all kinds of sanitizing equipment and devices and products and so forth like that. What the world realized is that China controlled a lot of that manufacturing. And we could not get out of them all the amounts that we needed. Some were being retained for their own utilization. And even companies like 3M, as an example, which had their own factories in China, had difficulty pulling the product out of those factories at that point in time. So a lot of companies, just for the concern over the risks associated in doing business in a place isolated like China, have now created big, diversified, and multiple sourcing models, which might add some expense at the end of the day, but really lower the risks dramatically. So the key here is the ability to understand that in alternative sourcing is that what we really want to do is to set up where we have in our staff either amount of our own time, depending upon the size of the staff, or people on our staff dedicated to actually spending time in certain critical commodities that we have, and higher expense in viewing our spend where more money is spent is looking to see where there are other options that exist. And then going back and building those landed cost models to see whether or not the benefits exist. And the countries that I mentioned before are examples, but we also have gone to countries like Turkey, Spain, Germany, Great Britain, okay, Ireland as well, for some manufacturing of some industrial products that have actually been competitive to what we see in China. And the other last thing I mentioned about alternative sourcing is the concept related to bringing things back here to the United States. There are a lot of advantages to bringing it back to the United States, but one of them relates to the foreign trade zones, because a lot of companies are looking to the fact that if they could minimize the impact of those tariffs and duties, okay, that might offset the additional cost of labor here in the United States. So it's something to look at for the concept of bringing back manufacturing here into the United States. An interesting concept goes all the way back to the mid-1800s, is what referred to as tariff engineering. Tariff engineering is a little bit more complicated and more comprehensively structured option for us in lowering, our costs involved in our product. And what it really is a legitimate way of manipulating or changing the design of a product, okay, or its materials used in the process in order to be able to reduce the duty rate. An example of this that I'd like to share with the company that we just worked with that's based up in Seattle, Washington. The company brings in all kinds of sports clothing, jackets, sweaters, pullovers, tights, things that are used for workouts and so forth like that. Things that would be sold in a Dick's sporting goods store, as an example. The range of duty on their goods that they bring in, and they source from about 20 different countries around the world, and they bring in close to about $500 million worth of imports. Their duty rates go from about 3.5% to as much as 11.5%, depending upon the product and where it originates from. However, if they were to put a particular chemical into the manufacturing process that created a resistance to water or made it a waterproof product, okay, that they could do for cents per product, they could now bring it in at a duty-free rate. So they go from that 3.5 to 11.5% rate down to 0. So the model that we studied for them was if they increase their cost by 2.5, 3 cents a product, but were able to reduce the duty rates of $5 and $6, $7 per item when they came in, that would be a huge benefit. So now almost 90% of what they bring in from overseas has this waterproof quality, even in many cases where it doesn't even need it. But the idea is that it gives them that reduced rate. So the concept of tariff engineering is the legitimate process of looking at what options you can do in the manufacturing process, the materials used, in order for you to legitimately bring in something under a different harmonized tariff number, which produces a lower duty rate. In the Lincoln administration, this actually came in a case that went to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court ruled that so long as no deception is practiced, so long as the goods are truly invoiced and freely and honestly exposed to the officers of customs for their examination, no fraud is committed, no penalty is incurred, that tariff engineering is a legitimate option in global trade. The Supreme Court went further in another case that said the general position taken by customs in these rulings is that if customs finds the article at the time of importation is a commercial reality, then the tariff engineering will not be considered a fraud or an artifice. In the case in which customs has found that the tariff engineering was a fraud or artifice, customs concluded that the article was not a commercial reality because the article was not sold or otherwise entered into the stream of commerce in the condition as imported. So when I gave the slide earlier about the collaboration, for those of us in the supply chain, this is working with our R&D people, our marketing, sales, our product developers, our technicians, to see if in fact there might be the ability to slightly manipulate how a product is manufactured, the materials used in the manufacturing process, where we might be able to derive a benefit in lowering our landed cost. So in tariff engineering, we have to be creative and substantively aggressive. Really, because of the complexity of this, you need to obtain professional guidance, and there are lots of companies like myself that are available to that. I'll be more than happy to point anybody in any direction. You have to have total transparency. This is not a clandestine activity. You have to have well thought out decisions. And at the end of the day, you're going to turn over many stones to make sure that, in fact, the process you're going through is legitimized. And lastly, is you really need to be extremely diligent in your process. So another area that we focus on is demand planning. And if you notice the pictures that I show a DHL aircraft taking off and a ocean container vessel. Because in international trade, those are the two main ways that we move freight from point A to point B. It doesn't make a difference whether it's coming in from Germany, if it's coming in from Brazil, or it's coming in from China. These are the two main methods. And appreciate the fact that ocean freight, as a general rule, is 18 times less expensive than air freight when you look at it as a per cubic meter or a per kilo basis, which means that if we have a preference and our business model allows, we generally want to always use ocean freight as the option. When we go into a company and we're involved in a supply chain audit or review, we look at the freight spend, and we specifically look at how much is being spent on ocean freight and how much is being spent on air freight. And if more than 5% of the spend is in air freight, that raises a red flag to us. And when we investigate the reason why, it comes right back to this subject, which is demand planning, which is the concept that why is air freight being used? It's being used because the process of putting orders in is not being done as diligently and as timely and as responsibly as it should be. And therefore, we're being forced to use air freight to get things out of manufacturing and production into our warehouses and to our clients as quickly as we can. So we're being forced to use a faster mode of transportation and not the slower mode of ocean freight that would be more ideal. So we go right into demand planning and we pick that apart to determine what the issues are. The two main factors of demand planning is historical data and anticipated needs of our clients today and down the road in the future. Okay. Generally, the failing is not the collection of the historical data. That's usually very, very valuable and viable. Okay. It's the communication that you get and feedback you get from your customers as to what their needs are on a timely and reliable basis. That's really where we focus on. And that means we go right to the salespeople and customer service people who have those relationships with those customers. And we tighten that part of the demand planning process up very well. And every so often, technology will come into play where we get a technology which is more robust and allows for a more likely result or better result in the turnout of what the demand planning needs might be. So I've listed a couple of resources for all of you to go to. relative to this whole subject. CBP is Customs, DOC is Department of Commerce. Always keep in mind that all trade activities and the International Trade Administration is under the Department of Commerce. Trade.gov is specially designed area to go to in the Department of Commerce website that discusses all kinds of issues involved in import and export activity. And for those of you that are involved in the export side of the world, export.gov is another excellent resource. Also created a number of links for you that I think might be valuable in this whole subject matter, particularly as it relates to the 232 and 301 tariffs. Obviously, it originated with Trump, but now it's Biden's issue here and so forth. The idea here is that we're trying to make decisions. The more informed decisions that we make are usually better. So having these resources that I mentioned before and all these here really help us to make better decisions. Another resource is what's called CROSS. I've created a picture here of the website. It stands for customs rulings, and you can put in a commodity or a classification or a customer's name or a product name, and it gives you all the rulings that came out of customs relative to that product, which helps you determine what the duty rates might be or how something needs to be packed, marked, or labeled, okay, or how customs is going to handle a particular product that might be entering or that has entered the United States. I've been fortunate enough to write a couple of books, actually 19 of them, on international business. These two that I put here actually do have sections in them that relate to all the subjects that we talked about today. So they're actually two resources to you. They're available on Amazon, or you can certainly come to me. We keep an inventory as well. So we created a model for the whole thought process of looking at reducing landed costs. It has 4 steps to it. The first is an assessment. This can be done internally or using outside resources, such as a company like ours, of which there are many companies that do this work. That has to be turned into an operational model. How do we make things happen? What changes have to be made in your supply chain? We create a financial model at the same time, which allows us to create that return on investment. You saw examples of those financial models in the body of this webinar. And lastly, implementation is actually making it happen. So all those resources I gave to you gives you the foundation to be able to handle all 4 of these steps that are involved. And you also obviously have outsourced options for yourself as well. So I'll open it up to any questions that many of you have. And also want to mention to you that I'm going to offer to you this book that I have, this particular one that I'm holding up, which is Driving Risk and Spend Out of the Global Supply Chain. So if any of you would like to receive this book, the question that I've asked there, which is outlined in green, is what city outside the United States receives more visitors than any other city every day? So what city outside the United States receives more visitors than any other city outside the United States? So my email address, which is located on this slide right here, so whoever sends me the first email and has the correct answer, I will get your address and then send you this book. So I appreciate everybody's kind attention, and I'll open it up to any questions that anybody might have.
Thank you, Tom. That was a very thorough presentation. I'm not sure if anybody's going to have any questions because you probably answered them already. But thank you so much. So much information packed into 1 hour is fantastic. At this time, I would like, because we are drawing close to the end of the hour, I would like to thank you, Tom, for your presentation. And we will have this program available on our YouTube channel, probably by later today or tomorrow. Excuse me. At this time, I also would like to let everybody know, please make sure to register for Tom's May 6th program